Hi, everyone. This is Margaret Smith. I'm the Executive Director of the Trumpeter Swan Society, and I want to welcome you to our webinar, Ask a Swan Expert. It's going to be a great webinar. We're going to be answering a lot of the questions that came in over past webinars. So you're in for a whole lot of Q&A. Today's webinar is being recorded. You are muted and your video is turned off. And if you have questions, there is a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen that you could add, and we'll try to get to those at the end. And when you close your browser at the end of the webinar, there is going to be a very brief survey, and you will receive a link to the recording probably on Saturday after I get it uploaded to YouTube. Very quickly about the Trumpeter Swan Society. We've been around since 1968, and our major programs are restoration and management, education, trumpeter watch, advocacy, and swan health. And we'll be touching on some of those things today. And our expert presenters are Dr. Ken Abraham, Dr. Michael Anderson, Dave Hoffman, and Dr. Gary Ivey. So let's see here. So let's get started. So Gary, how can you identify between the three swan species? And then anyone can help answer this question of, do they have similar nesting behaviors and habitat? So Gary, want to help with that?
Should I have my video on?
Sure, you can have your video on.
Okay. Well, basically, trumpeters are the largest species of swans that you'll find in North America. They have a very angular head and skull. One of the easiest characteristics is this wedge that goes back and includes this mask includes the eye of the trumpeter. Tundra swans, which are the other native species, have a very rounded skull, and a high percentage of them have a yellow teardrop in the adults, but that's not a great character because you'll see some yellow wash in trumpeters occasionally. There's also generally in trumpeters a red line along the edge of the mandible, which you don't generally see in tundra swans, but this very rounded skull, and the eye, when you see it from a distance, appears to be a little bit separate from this mask that includes the bill. So that's one major difference. We also have mute swans, which the adults have this knob on their bill, and they've got usually an orange or a pink hue to most of the beak as adults. The juveniles have kind of a two-tone bill also. And then geese have black wingtips on the white geese, and are much smaller than swans.
Okay, and Mike or Ken, do you want to answer if these species have similar nesting behavior and habitats?
Yes, it's Ken here. So yeah, they do have basically similar nesting behaviors between the species. One of the key differences is the ranges of the three species of large swans. So the most northerly group is the tundra swans, and they basically nest in treeless areas in the Arctic and subarctic. And then slightly further south, the trumpeters, which nest in forested habitats like open forest called taiga or boreal forest, right down into settled areas of central North America. And at one point, they were widespread throughout the temperate areas. Now that's where they've been restored. And then the mute swans are more urban. They may occasionally stray to the Arctic, but they don't nest in the Arctic or subarctic. They're not really a forested species. They're large, open, deep lakes, more colonial than the other species. But in terms of other aspects of nesting behavior, it's quite similar.
Thank you. One of the ways that we say you can tell the difference between trumpeter swans, tundras, and mutes are the sound, size, and shape. And thanks to people for submitting some of these photos. This is Donna Lewis. So here's a mute swan, here's a tundra swan, and here's a trumpeter swan. And you can see the difference here between the trumpeter and the tundra. And this is another photo from Dan Casey. This is showing the same the size. So here's the trumpeter swan and here's the tundra. And tundras also have kind of a concave shape there. And here's a photo of 3 trumpeter swans. You can see how large they are compared to this little tundra that's there. And it's really the most important thing to tell the difference between tundras and trumpeters is the sound. Now, I'm going to be playing some videos here. And in this one, this is tundra swan calls, but you won't hear the tundra swans until the very end. And this is kind of giving you the experience if you were out and about and you see some swans flying in, you may not know if they're trumpeter swans or tundras. So you'll need to listen to the call. And this is taken out at Church Slough in Montana. And these are actually tundra swans coming in. You can hear they have a higher pitched call. Same location, these are trumpeter swans. So really what we tell people is, if you can't tell the difference when they're flying in, listen for the sound of it because it's the sound that's really definitive. So Dave Hoffman, why are some swan heads and necks orange or brown?
So it's typically due to the tannins that are found in the water, but they can also have some of the iron-rich minerals, like in Minnesota, for example, can lead to some of the staining and some of the coloring on their swan's head.
Okay, can you tell a swan gender by sight?
It can be, but it can be difficult. I've been able to tell a little bit when swans are side by side. One thing is typically the female will be on the nest, but there's occasionally the male can be on the nest, but it's really rare. But typically by sight, you can tell by their build. The male can be a little larger, kind of a little thicker neck and a little blockier head, and just the female just a little more slender. But it is really difficult to tell unless they're side by side.
Right, and when we're doing, when we're getting swans for some of our programs like the Oregon Restoration Program, you know, they also will take blood samples or cloacal exam to actually see determine what the gender is, because generally by sight, if you're not, you know, an expert swan biologist, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. A lot of times I get questions about where can I see swans, and I just want to let you know that on our website, on our Report a Swan page, there are links to different things. So you can download a list of all the national wildlife refuges and the zoos that have trumpeter swans. There's a link for eBird through Cornell, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in just a minute, but you'll need to create your own account for that. And Cornell just came out in the past couple of months with live migration maps. You can also link to that on our Report a Swan page. And this is the link for that. So just quickly to tell you a little bit about eBird. So when you sign up for an account with eBird, what you'll do is you'll put in the species name, you'll put trumpeter swan. And what I decided to do was to show you the trumpeter swan sightings near the office of the Trumpeter Swan Society. So here you can see, you know, Minneapolis. And we're going to go to this sighting right here, which is a red hotspot. But if you see these little red teardrops, those are birding hotspots within the last 30 days. The blue ones, those are birding hotspots that are more than 30 days old. So you'll just zoom in on that and you can go to the location to see if they're, you know, recent birds in your area. And looking at this closer, here's actually where the offices for Trumpeter Swan Society. This is Medicine Lake. So now we're going to take a look at this red hotspot. So you would just zoom in and click on that. And when you do that, then you can see, this is at East Medicine Lake Park. You can see, you know, who reported trumpeter swans and what was the date of that. And then if you click in even more, you can get directions or, you know, find out where that park is. And then these are all the other bird species that were observed on the 16th of October at that location. So if you want to know where trumpeter swans are, your best bet is to go to eBird, get an account and check out the area that you're looking for. So Ken, a lot of times people want to know if swans have special names for different age limits or sex or whatever. So can you answer these questions, please, Ken?
Sure. Males are often called cubs. Females are hens or hens even. Baby swans are cygnets. Large gray swan generally refers to a cygnet from the point where it's fledged until late in the first summer after it's hatched, when they begin to turn white. So if it's got a lot of gray, it's an immature bird of some kind. A white swan without a mate or family, it's a white swan generally is an adult, 20 months or older, or subadult, sorry, 20 months, or an adult, which is 2 years to 2 years plus. I don't know of a name for a swan family unit other than family. That's the common name used in the scientific literature. And a brood is basically a reference to the young hatched birds from hatching until they're fledged and maybe into the fall. But it's really a reference to the period when they're flightless as a young family that the parents will cover and brood in for warmth at night.
Great, thanks. Okay, Dave, how long do swans live and what are the ages where they pair up and breed?
We've seen mark swans live up to 24 to 26 years in the wild. There's been captive swans in zoos, for example, been known to live 28 to 33 years. As far as pairing up and breeding, it can be quite variable. Typically, I've seen 4 to 6 years for a female before she'll pair up and nest, or it's typically 6 years before she actually lays. Males do go a little sooner, typically 3 to 4 years of age. I've seen a male that actually bred at 2 would be the youngest, Alaskan male. The youngest female, I believe, was 4 from Alaska. But they do seem like they do kind of do pair bonds. It's a kind of a process, and it seems like I've seen pair bonding begin at age typically 3 to 4, with nesting again typically earliest is about 6. It does seem like it does vary on the body conditioning of the birds too. If they're in better body conditioning, they do kind of pair up and breed sooner as well. And bigger swans too do seem like they breed quicker as well.
Great. Okay, so courtship and Ken, Gary, or Mike can answer these questions. What is the courtship cycle and how do you recognize it? Is it year-round or at specific times, and is it different from pair bonding? Mike, did you want to start with that?
Yeah, I'll start. And Dave has already touched on this a little bit. Young birds begin forming liaisons, sort of tentative pair bonds, as soon as they start displaying, and typically around 2-3 years of age. Those may be ephemeral; they may not last very long. And
whoops, I think you froze, Mike. Gary or Ken, you want to continue with that?
Sure, it's Ken. So yeah, as Mike was explaining, so it's a gradual process. Courtship is perhaps the similar to what we call mate selection or pair bonding, and it's a gradual process where individuals will associate with with birds of the other sex. They may associate with a series of them, get to know them. They'll display to each other, communicate. They're looking for compatibility, and they try out a lot of different mates over the course of 2 or 3 years. It can be quicker than that, but the process will last a few years until they develop a good firm bond and then stay together. They gradually spend more and more time together and always you know, spatially closer than they would with other birds. Mike, are you back?
I can add in there too, on rare exceptions, that courtship can be pretty quick. For example, a bird loses a mate. They can choose a mate, I've seen within 3 to 4 weeks, and be laying eggs within a month. So it's kind of rare, but they can choose a mate quick. And I've actually even seen where an aggressive bird will come in and actually steal a mate, and where that courtship and nesting and such can be pretty short there as well.
Okay, I'm going to show you a couple of videos. This is, sometimes people say, well, how can I tell if a swan is going to copulate? And I've seen this. So this is synchronized head dipping. Photographers usually like to know, hey, am I going to be able to see something where I can photograph it? So here's the pair right here, and they head dip together. That's sort of a precursor to copulation.
This doing it together, synchronized, is very common, and geese as well.
Oh, okay, great. Okay, so here's going to be the actual copulation. This is on a wintering site, and this is the male, and that's the female right there. Again, if you want to explain anything, go ahead.
Sure. Well, the male, and again, this is similar across all swans and geese. The male will grasp the back of the neck of the female, probably for stability. But they're not pushing the female's head underwater. You notice in the sequence that the female's head was underwater before that. And this, after the copulation, there's often wing flapping by both pairs. They may face each other, and that's a common post-copulatory display. And again, it's common across the whole family of geese and swans.
And in this case, that little cygnet there really didn't like that, so they were hurried along. Okay. On our website, we have tons of information, and sometimes people want to know more about swan behavior. So if you go to our FAQ page, right here, you'll just download this as what are swans doing. And Harry Lumsden, the late Larry Lumsden from Ontario, had written a paper about swan behavior. So if you download it, this is what you'll see. And there are pictures in there as well, where he talks about brood defense and territorial behavior and all kinds of great things. So just look for that on our website. So here's more questions. How do swans choose a territory? When do swans copulate? And how does that time with egg laying? And do swans mate for life? And what happens after a mate dies? So Gary, Ken, and Dave, feel free.
I talk about the territory. My experience, I worked at Malheur Refuge, which is in Southeast Oregon, for quite a few years, and I worked with the trumpeters there. And the best territory on the refuge was a roughly 20 acres of open water pond that had really good food. Swans, like a lot of birds, have a pecking order, and they're dominant, and the dominant pairs are going to get the best territory that's available. So there's, and generally female swans want to be nesting in their natal area, the area where they first learn to fly, and so they'll return and try to find a mate with a territory in that area. So there's a lot of competition. So it's hard to say what's perfect. Some swans have territories that are an entire small lake, like 200 or 300 acres, but 20 acres seems to be pretty good. They choose that by fighting over who gets the best territory available, basically. That's how they choose a territory within their breeding range, where they have a lot of swans available and they're pretty saturated.
Okay, thank you. And for copulation and egg laying, does copulation like start at a certain time, or is it let's say from the winter onward, and is there copulation up until the time of egg laying? You can answer that question.
I can try that. So in a pair that's been formed for some time and is familiar with each other, the copulation can occur anytime from fall through winter into spring. in fall and winter, it's a pair bonding, pair reinforcing behavior. And this is, again, common from mallards to geese to swans. The frequency of copulation in the spring, pre-nesting, like in late March, February, March, and depending on the latitude where the nesting is occurring, the frequency will increase. And they will copulate on a daily basis between eggs as they're laid so that there's fresh sperm. The earlier copulations, say up to 2 or 3 weeks prior to the first eggs, the sperm can be stored in the female's reproductive tract. And if something were to happen to the male, that sperm could fertilize the eggs when they are ovulated.
Great. Okay, and then do swans mate for life, and what happens after a mate dies? Who'd like to answer that one?
I can answer that one. So I've seen swans that have mated for life or been together for over 24 years. But I've also seen where swans lose a mate and they'll actually choose a new mate. For example, we have a bird in Iowa here. We call her the white widow. She's actually on number 5. She lost her first mate to a power line. She lost one to lead, another one to disease and a power line, but she's chosen a new mate and nested successfully after that. And so in some ways I describe them like people too. If a bigger, better looking swan comes along, and sometimes they'll even swap or choose a new mate as well. But oftentimes they do mate for life, but there's certainly exceptions out there as well where they'll choose new mates.
Okay, great. Ken from Ontario, what have you found with your tracking of your swans in terms of, mates, that kind of thing?
Right. Okay, well, I can reinforce some of what Dave said. Yeah, the general rule is mating for life as long as both birds are alive. We do have some evidence of divorce, but we've got over 300,000 sightings of tagged swans in Ontario, and we've only got one documented case of what we call divorce or remating with different birds. So both the male and female were alive. They separated. Both of them took new mates and produced offspring. So they had been a viable pair, and then they separated. There's also a temporary separation thing. An example would be a female was taken into captivity for treatment of lead poisoning, and she was held for several months. And during that time, the male began associating with another female and was looking to develop, it appeared to be developing a mate, a pair, a good pair. But then when the original female was released, he immediately switched back to the original female. So there's both a recognition and a bonding thing being shown there.
Thank you. Okay, so when and how do swans build nests, and when and how do they lay eggs, and when do they start incubating? And how large a wetland does a swan pair need to raise a family? Gary, you want to answer when and how do swans build nests and lay eggs, and when do they start incubating?
They often take advantage of a small island if that's available, if it's secure from predators, or and they really like building nests on beaver and muskrat lodges also and adding to those. But generally they start building nests just pre-incubation about 2 or 3 weeks before, and the male does most of the work, I believe, but they pull up vegetation, usually like cattails or hardstem bulrush or some other emergent vegetation if it's available, and build a big platform that can be like 10 feet in diameter and 4 or 5 feet tall. They need, if they're in an area where they get a lot of potential flooding, they need a floating nest. And so that's basically the nest building thing. How do they lay eggs? Well, just like any bird. Once they're ready to breed, they lay an egg every other day, basically, and they start incubating towards the end of that egg laying period. They lay between 2 to up to 9 or 10 eggs, which is the extreme. Most clutches are about 5 eggs, and they incubate for about 30 days, and here come the cygnets.
Okay, And how large a wetland does a swan pair need to raise a family?
My experience at Mount Here Refuge, they've raised families on as small as like 4 or 5 acres of open water wetland, with a lot of emergent marsh around. It kind of depends on how good the food supply is, the size they really need to raise their family. They need enough food in that system to feed a hungry growing brood of cygnets. So, but they, like, as I said, they can choose a very large wetland if there's no other competition, and sometimes some aggressive, very dominant pairs will keep other swans from nesting on a 200-300 acre wetland.
And Dave, did you want to mention anything about what you've seen in terms of incubation and let's say the timing of hatch versus, because of incubation varying?
Yeah, I've seen where it seems like the female, she'll start incubating, but at times even lay another egg 1 or 2 days, 3 days after incubation. And so that can explain why at times the majority of the brood will hatch. The male will actually sometimes take them off the nest, start the feeding process, and that female will still be incubating and kind of hatch out 1 late or 2 late cygnets, anywhere from 1 to 4 days later is what I've seen. Is so it can vary a little bit on the hatch and incubating with those.
Okay, great. Okay, I'm going to show you this video I took. This is just showing how the male is kind of patrolling in the wetland, and the female is on the nest right here. So generally during that nesting season, you can generally tell which one is the female and which one is the male because of who's on the nest. Now, there are exceptions. Now here, this is showing a female is going to be turning the egg. So here's the nest right here. And yeah, so she's turning the eggs to make sure that the albumin and all the parts of it are, not sticking to the shell, and, to have a healthy embryo. And then here's a red-winged blackbird, which is very common on wetlands.
I'd just like to reinforce that it's 99% of the time the bird on the nest is a female. Males may occasionally go to the nest to check out of curiosity whether the eggs are still there, but males and trumpeter swans don't incubate. They don't develop a brood patch. For example, females develop a brood patch where there's a bare area of skin to transfer heat to the eggs.
Thank you. Okay, so now we're getting into swan behavior, which is why are swans aggressive during nesting in the first summer with cygnets? How many descendants can a swan have over its lifetime, and how many swans on average survive from hatch to breeding age? So is Mike back on or not?
I have just returned. My apologies. The electricity went out here and then I had to reboot the router. So
wow,
I'm just back.
Okay. Well, we're glad to have you back, Mike. Okay, so why don't you answer?
Well, I'll start, but then I'm going to pass it off to Dave first, and I think Gary for some more details here. But anyway, swans basically defend an area around their nest where they also will feed when the pen takes a break from incubation, and the cob hangs out and can feed, and where the cygnets will be fed when they first emerge from the nest. So it's what ornithologists call the type 1 or type A territoriality kind of system. Waterfowl vary in how territorial they are and whether it includes other species, and for how long during the breeding season they're territorial. You see a swan here chasing away a Canada goose. They seem to be variably intolerant of Canada geese, but often will keep them away from their breeding site as well. The question of descendants, I think it was Dave who had some interesting information on that.
I've seen a wild pair, they had at least 40 or 50 cygnets, but then you start to add up those cygnets once they start producing. So it becomes into the And one pair can be up into the hundreds. You kind of trace it over time. Oh, I was going to add back to about the pair and nesting in the male. I've actually seen the male incubating, but it was actually after the female, she died on the nest. It was kind of a sad watch. This female was on the nest, but deceased, but the male took over the last incubating for about 10 days. And he actually then raised the cygnets too, which was quite remarkable as just the single male lone parent rearing those cygnets.
Interesting.
You should write that up. I think that's a very rare observation.
That was extremely rare. Next question is about how cygnets survive after hatch. Seems like here in Iowa, we lose nearly 75% of those cygnets before they reach their breeding age. So there is some high mortality. We'll chat about a little more later in the slide, but it seems like once they do reach that breeding age, they do have pretty good survival and can live quite long after that many years.
Great.
I just like to add from the Ontario database of observations and tagging that we've had. I'll just give two examples. One was a male who is currently 24 years old. He's had 2 mates over his life, 12 known nestings, and we probably didn't catch them all. And he fledged, the pair fledged 45 cygnets. And then we have a 20-year-old female who was known to have 17 nests. So she began nesting as a 3-year-old. She also had 2 mates, and they fledged 74 cygnets. And in 1 year, she actually raised 10 cygnets, which is, we think, a North American record.
Wow. Okay, so how do swans know where to spend the winter, and what happens during migration? Why do swan pairs return to the same location, and how much length of water or land does a swan need for takeoff and landing? So Gary, I think you were going to answer some of those.
I'll answer the first one. Basically, swans, start out as a family unit, and when the cygnets learn to fly, they spend some time on their natal areas, where they hatched, getting strong. And then when the weather starts changing, they go with their parents to the wintering areas and learn the migration routes and different stopover spots and their winter destination. And they tend to imprint on those sites. And if birds get separated from their parents, cygnets, they will explore on their own or join other groups of swans. But generally, that's how they learn where to go in the winter. And with these restored populations, particularly the interior population of the Midwest and some of the efforts out here in the West, some of these birds that are released from captivity into the wild are exploring new winter locations and routes, not always successful, but so that's basically how they learn. And what I tell people, they're very traditional. So most of these pairs, if they've got a breeding territory, they own that piece of real estate up in the north. And they're like people that have a house in Canada and a house in Arizona. They've got their winter home, which is their destination, and they've got their summer home, which is the breeding area, and then they got their favorite restaurants where they stop along the way between those sites. And if things aren't good at some particular stopover spot or winter spot, then that's when they may fly off with some of the other swans that know other, I call it flock memory, other swans in the flock may know someplace else that's better, and take them and help expand their knowledge and range.
Okay. And Dave, maybe you can help answer this question about how much length of water or land does a swan need for takeoff and landing?
Yeah, so that can be quite variable too, particularly on the age of the swan and the strength. Many times it's, for an adult, it's 40 to 60 yards or meters. But I've seen too, of a young swan, they just don't have the strength, endurance, and it takes them over sometimes 100 yards, meters to be running on the water and finally get airborne. So again, it mainly the strength, but it can be quite a long runway. They compare these birds like the B-52 of the bird world, and they take a long runway.
Right. And what about the direction of the wind?
Oh yeah, that's good. Is the typically into the wind, they can get greater lift and quicker takeoff.
Okay. I'm going to show a couple of videos here. So this is takeoff. This is in the wintertime, so it's a group takeoff. But families travel together, but a bunch of swans may come together. So this is takeoff, so you can see how much water they need to take off. And this is going to be landing, and this is a swan pair flying in. You can hear all the calls going on from all the other trumpeter swans. Here they're landing, and that's a pair. So they're going to do a little pair bonding, face each other. But here's the swan that wasn't happy to see them, who's going over to join that group. But it doesn't phase the pair, just a bonding. Okay, so now for our cygnets first year. When does a cygnet learn to fly? Do cygnets migrate with their parents in the fall and in the spring? And what do juveniles do after their first year of life up to the time that they mate? So, Dave, when does a cygnet learn to fly?
Typically, I've seen the average is about 108 days, but it can vary between 90 and 123 days. Again, it seems like it varies on the diet, food availability, but yeah.
But generally, if a swan hatches, if a cygnet hatches, let's say in late May, maybe by the end of August, early September, mid-September, they'll learn to fly.
Yep, typically by the end of August, early September, and it's when they typically learn to fly. And it does seem like there is more problems with power lines and such too. When they first learn to fly, they're just kind of naive and they get into more trouble.
Okay. And Ken, Dave, you can both answer this one. Do cygnets migrate with their parents in the fall and then also in the spring?
So typically they do migrate with their parents in the fall. We've had a few cases too. We had some marked cygnets and they were without their parents. And so the parents were alone. We assumed the cygnets had perished, but they were actually adopted by another pair and shown up on the wintering ground.
Okay, Ken, did you want to add anything to that? Because I'm wondering, I mean, what would be the importance of the cygnet staying with the parents during that first migration?
Okay, yeah, no, again, this is a common element of the behavior of the large waterfowl like geese and swans. Strong family pair bonds are the rule, and the exception for juveniles to be separated from their parents before migration. But in large concentrations of birds where there's lots of disturbance, that separation can happen. But again, the general rule is that yes, the family bond is strong from the beginning. They migrate together and stay together through the first winter. This is applicable to Canada geese, snow geese, and all of the swans. In the spring, because these species are repeat breeders, like once they begin to breed at 2, 3, or 4 years old, they'll breed annually. And again, that's the general rule. They can take a year off occasionally because of body condition or something else if they've lost a mate. But the general rule is that they'll breed each spring and summer following their first breeding. And if they've produced young in that successfully in that breeding in the previous year, they don't want those young to be hanging around the nest and potentially attracting predators while they're nesting. So they actively will fend off the young and softly shoo them away over a gradual period, so that then in the spring the juveniles are on their own. And often sibling groups will stay together for the summer. They'll join up with other sibling groups and other non-breeders, perhaps some adults who have failed breeding in general groups in non-breeding habitat. And then they'll begin to wander after that. And Mike, you might want to say something about that.
Yeah, the period of time between separation of the young from the adults and the time that those young breed themselves is not a really well-studied time of the year, in part because the birds move around a lot. They will hang out with broodmates, but they'll also hook up with other swans, and they tend to wander widely and show up in unexpected places. This sort of juvenile wandering is really quite common in long-lived waterfowl. Somebody described it like teenagers at a shopping mall. They're out just kind of checking things out, and eventually they'll begin to think about forming pair bonds of their own. You'll see the first hints of courtship and development of liaisons between young birds in second, third year of life, which continues until the time where they have a well-established pair and begin to nest a couple, 3 years later. So that's how they're spending most of their time after they're excused from the natal brood.
So I've typically seen when they return to their nesting area, the pair returns to their nesting area in the spring. It's really quite short period, 3 to 4 days. It seems like they'll give those cygnets when they return to that nest area. They'll give those cygnets kind of the boot, and then it seems like those cygnets will like you say, go off and explore. And what I've seen is, we'll talk about it in a bit, but the molt migration is those cygnets will all be exploring. Typically, most of what we see is they go north. Iowa swans have typically been up in Minnesota, parts of Manitoba and Ontario, but it seems like it's about 4 years. Then they return to that natal area, that area where they learn to imprint and fly. And it's typically more so the females that return back to that natal area.
Okay, great. Thank you. So communications, what are some reasons why swans bob their heads? Anybody want to answer that? Gary?
Oh, I can jump in when Gary's coming. One of the reasons is to synchronize departure or family behavior. So head bobbing is a common element of several displays. You saw it in the copulatory process. It's also common in the what's called the triumph ceremony, where they're announcing their presence and reinforcing their dominance in an area. It's ritualized based on common behaviors, in this case, bathing. So bathing often is preceded by head bobbing. But I think one of the main areas is where they're in advance of flying, and in order to synchronize the readiness of the pairs or family members to leave a site together. That's one of those common times where you see the head bobbing, as you did in that video.
And I'll just add that all species of waterfowl do something like this. In some cases, they flick their bills. In other cases, they bob their heads like these guys do. But that's very widespread in the waterfowl all over the world. They'll have some kind of motion like that they go through before taking flight.
Okay, I'm going to show you a few more videos. So sometimes people say, what does a trumpeter swan cygnet sound like? So it's a little bit more hollow. This is a cygnet right there. Okay, this is going to be an alarm call. This is on a wintering site. You'll notice that, some of these swans are at attention. Their heads and necks are up, and they have a staccato alarm call. And this is on a nesting territory. The female is on the nest, but here's the male in the wetland. And he hears, way before I heard it, but he heard a trumpeter swan pair that was going to be flying over. And so this was his reaction to that. Yeah, that's his threatening behavior there. But he was warning the pair flying overhead that he was down there. Okay, so now we're going to get to molt. And Mike, you can if you would answer these, would be great. What is molt? What happens? Is it the same for ducks and geese? What time of year does it happen? And what are molt migrations?
Okay. Molt refers to the changeover in feathers, and with waterfowl, they're unusual in that they tend to molt their flight feathers. The ones that you see here with the pinkish cast because they're newly regrowing primary and secondary feathers. They molt them simultaneously, so they are flightless for a period of time, usually a couple of well, a month to 2 months, depending on the size of the bird. They do it synchronously. They tend to choose areas with stable water, good food supplies, and so on to do it. But in the case of the swans, they do it with their brood because there's only so much time. There wouldn't be enough time between the fledging of the young and then molting and then getting ready to migrate themselves. So one or the other of the adults, and it seems to typically be the male, but it can be either one, will molt about the time that the cygnets hatch. So one of the members of the pair are fully flighted and in a better position to defend the brood and so on, while the other molts their feathers. They both still attend the brood. It's just that one of them is not able to fly. The pattern is a little different in geese and ducks, depending on the species, but they all go through a period of flightlessness, whether it's with the ducklings or after they've left the ducklings. It happens in the summer, mid to late summer, prior to migration. Molt migrations refer to a separate thing that happens with failed breeders or immature birds that don't have pairs yet, aren't breeding yet. Whereas, as Dave mentioned, they tend to wander in a group toward the north to more stable, typically larger water bodies where there's a good amount of food supply. And we see here in Manitoba, we see a conspicuous molt migration of especially giant Canada geese from the Midwest that aren't breeding as they head north to molt. And we're seeing more and more trumpeter swans doing the same thing. Now, the geese and swans are looking for different kinds of habitats, but it's getting away from the breeding area and moving to areas where they feel safe and have a good food supply to be flightless for a period of time.
Great. Thank you. It's 10 minutes to the hour, and if anyone has any questions, you can please put them in the Q&A box. We have tons more questions to go through, but I don't think we're going to have enough time for those. So we wanted to make sure that if you had any questions, you could put them in the Q&A box, and Marianne Coughlin is going to be keeping an eye on that. In the meantime, I'm going to, let's see, I'm going to fast forward to, let's say here, mute swans. So this was some questions that came up, which are mute and trumpeter swan interaction. So Ken, if you want to answer some of these. So because Ontario actually has quite a few mute swans competing along with trumpeter swans. So do mute swans cause any issues for trumpeter swans? And are there any special issues in Southern Ontario? How and when did mute swans arrive, and are they generally considered to be an invasive species in the wild? So Ken, if you have some time to answer at least a couple of those things about mute swan interactions, it'd be great.
Sure. I'm going to flip it around with the order and say mute swans were introduced to North America in the late 1800s, early 1900s from Eurasia, because people thought they wanted to have a familiar bird. The first introductions were in New York. A little bit later, they were introduced into Michigan in the 1930s, 1940s. So they are an invasive species by definition. They didn't arrive here naturally in North America. They don't have a suite of natural predators. They didn't develop alongside the native assemblage of species. And they have population characteristics associated with invasions. That's rapid, unchecked growth in some places. Ontario's growth rate is something like 10 or 12% at the present time. They spread geographically, and as I said, they lack a suite of natural predators. In terms of interactions, Harry Lumsden wrote a nice paper on competition for space. He looked at frequency of interactions and who are the winners. And generally, trumpeter swans dominate, partially because of their size, but partly because maybe they're innately more aggressive to other waterfowl. So in contests between the two species throughout the winter, the trumpeter swans had a very much higher attack rate than the mute swans did. An attack is anything from a small peck to a rush to chase off the birds they're pounding with wings. And so from that point of view, trumpeters seem to be doing well against mutes. However, mutes nest earlier, and so they'll claim a territory earlier. So where the two species overlap in southern Ontario, the mutes have a bit of an advantage in terms of getting their nest built and laying their eggs. And there, you can go into, and there's lots of little anecdotes about that, but that's the general story.
Okay, great. Marion, are there any questions? Otherwise, I'm going to go to Swan Health. Are there any questions that came in?
Yes, we do have several questions.
Okay, why don't you go ahead with that?
So the first question comes from Nicole. How frequently do coyotes kill trumpeter swans? And she's assuming that captive raised cygnets are more susceptible to predator kills. Do we agree with that? And then finally, what steps can be taken to reduce predator kills of cygnets on their release sites as part of a restoration program?
Okay, Gary, I think you have your hand raised to answer that.
Yes, I work with the Oregon program, and we've been using a lot of zoo and captive reared cygnets in our release programs. And those originally the first few years of our project, which started in 2009, the zoo cygnets had pretty high mortality. Even the wild cygnets had fairly high mortality the first year. But the zoo cygnets definitely were very naive. And so just last year, we started this program where the zoos are sending their cygnets to the Idaho Zoo so they can be more isolated and give them a whole winter to wild up there at the zoo, so they will hopefully be less naive and less vulnerable to predators. But coyotes are one of the main predators of young swans, and also any molting swan is susceptible if the water levels are low to coyotes. There are other predators like eagles that take swans. Mink can attack swans, but rarely kill them, I think. But for cygnets, great horned owls can take the cygnets. Mink, a lot of things can take the young cygnets before they fledge. So that's, I think I answered that.
Okay. Anybody else want to add anything?
Add snapping turtles as a predator of cygnets.
Yeah. Okay. Marianne, were there any other questions? Otherwise, I'm going to go to Swan Health.
Actually, we do have several other questions.
okay,
The first one is from Jessica. She's asking whether most Pacific population swans, do most Pacific population swans nest in Canada and Alaska? And where do the Rocky Mountain and interior populations nest? Are there a lot of nesting areas in the United States?
I'm going to bring up this in case this helps answer the question. Gary, did you want to get started on this? Can you answer, since all the populations are here?
Yeah, sure. In the West, we've got the Oregon Project, which is this big pink blob, which isn't quite that extensive, but it includes Malheur Refuge and Summer Lake Wildlife Area. And then the greater Yellowstone area, this big blue area here, is kind of the, it's called the tri-state Rocky Mountain population. That's kind of the core area where there are several restoration programs ongoing, because that flock, the Yellowstone flock, is down to just a couple pairs when historically they had about 30. There's been some very successful programs up in Montana, particularly the Flathead, which has a pretty healthy population now after about 20 years of work there. And then you can see in the Midwest, generally here where the swans are their breeding range. This brown circles the High Plains flock, which started out at La Creek Refuge back in the 60s. And all of these are restoration flocks, and plus the birds up in Ontario with the Ontario project. So that's pretty much their breeding distribution.
Okay, and then can you explain about the specific coast population where they're breeding up here in?
Yeah, they're breeding in BC and Alaska, and there's this
Yeah.
line here isn't really clear. There seems to be some genetic drift between these two populations in this area, but they're the birds in Alaska and Western BC and this part of Northwest Territories seem to go down through the Pacific coast, and most of them winter around southern BC, southwest BC, and northwest Washington, and the Skagit area in Washington.
Okay, and then these Canadian Rocky Mountain trumpeter swans, where do they go in the
Those-
winter?
Well, they're coming, most of those historically wintered in the greater Yellowstone area, and they've expanded in recent years. There are about 500 or so going to Summer Lake Wildlife Area in Oregon, and a few go to Malheur Refuge in Oregon, and some of those are moving into Utah, the Great Salt Lake Basin in the winter.
Right, and one of the things we found with our Oregon project where we have GPS trackers on swans that winter at Summer Lake in Oregon, they winter there, is that the GPS is showing them going up and spending the summer up here in, Alberta and yeah, right around in here, so. Okay. Any other questions, Marianne?
Yes. So as a follow-up question to the discussion on migration, is the situation different for trumpeters in the Great Lake Basin in terms of where they migrate?
I can answer a little bit from an Ontario perspective. There's a couple kinds of migration. There's a lot of short distance migration from central Ontario, which would be equivalent to the top of Michigan, for example. They migrate only down to southern Ontario, the majority of them. But we also have birds from farther north in the boreal of Ontario that will migrate all the way down into the states, Indiana, Ohio, down that region, almost 1,000 kilometers. So I think general in the Michigan, Ontario populations, and perhaps it applies to Wisconsin and parts of Minnesota as well. There are some birds that won't migrate. They'll find suitable habitat year round, or they'll do very short distance migrations, for example, from a breeding area to a larger lake or marsh system for winter, which may be just, 60 to 100 miles away.
Yeah, this is Margaret. I'm going to just say our next webinar is going to be David Wilson, who did the Midwest GPS tracking. That'll be, I think it's November 13. But he'll be explaining about the travels, the migration, and the movements of these swans, where some of them go long distances and some of them go short distances, and he'll explain all that as well. So it'll be an in-depth discussion of that. So, any other questions, Marianne?
We do have a few more, and I know we're getting close to the hour, so perhaps we can add, I'll ask one last question, and maybe we can add the rest to our list of unanswered questions for future webinars. But as a last question, what can people do to help the swans, particularly around habitat?
Dave, you want to start with that?
Yes, that's an excellent question there. And so some of the things people can do is report dead and sick swans, especially some of the things like power lines. One thing we do is keeping track of database where swan strikes are prevalent. And with that database, we identify high strike areas, work with power companies, landowners, and work to put up some bird diverters. Some other thing is just to report some sick swans, particularly like avian influenza, lead poisoning, and some of the other mortality that helps us keep track of how these swans are doing and identify some of the mortality types and try to address some of those. But probably one of the most important things is looking at habitat and the importance of our wetland habitat, not only for trumpeter swans, but for water quality. And would really appreciate the public support for wetlands, water quality, and conserving and protecting our current wetlands. And so some other things particularly can do is join and support our conservation programs partners and organizations out there like Trumpeter Swan Society, Ducks Unlimited, Delta Waterfowl, Pheasants Forever, all those conservation groups that support habitat, trumpeter swans, and bird conservation. And maybe Michael can kind of add to this as well.
No, that's a great list, Dave. Yeah, and just awareness of local wetland issues and opportunities to influence policy decisions at the local, state, and national levels to protect the habitats that these birds need. Swans are pretty unique in that they are wetland obligated to live in wetlands. They may feed in the field from time to time, but their lives revolve around the wetlands. So protecting wetlands is really critical. One other brief thing, and Margaret showed you what amazing data there's available on eBird. If people are interested, reporting your own sightings of trumpeter swans, wherever they might be, either to eBird or to the Trumpeter Swan Society, especially if they're marked birds, somehow, that helps us understand more about the expansion of their range and the places where the birds are and where they need protection.
Great. Okay. Well, I think that's all we have for today. And I want to say thank you to our speakers and our swan experts, and for you for coming and for all the questions that came in. What we'll do is after you close your browser, you'll have a brief survey, and I ask you for topics or any questions that you have. And we do use those. That's how this Swan webinar came about. So we hope you do that. And then in a couple of days after I have a chance to upload the recording, you will get the recording as well. So thanks so much for coming. I really appreciate that. And hopefully we'll see you again next time. Thank you.